Society knows that women have sex even when they don't want to. It just gets renamed in different societies or different scenarios, rather, and different contexts. And right now, there's a broader conversation happening over on TikTok around coercion, consent, and the way men and women communicate with one another. Specifically, in that instance, there's a voice memo that's been shared online where a man, we could use the word communicates, but he lets the woman know what it is that he would like or is expecting. And I think there's some really interesting conversation happening over there about consent, coercion, the state of dating more generally. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's so important, is that we often have accepted certain premises when it comes to women and sex in particular, especially within the scenario of marriage. And I find it very fascinating because outside of that scenario, we struggle often to believe women in particular and believe women when they say that they had sex, even if they didn't want to. And yet within the scenario of marriage, this has become an accepted premise. And it doesn't make any sense from a logical point of view. So let's walk through this together and talk about this because it comes up quite a lot. And I've seen some other creators, content creators, authors, etc., talk about this topic recently. So there's an accepted premise that wives should have sex even when they are tired, when they are stressed, when they are unwell, when they do not feel the desire to, when they would rather not. Okay, and so the existence of unwanted sex happening is not denied within marriage. In fact, I have sat and listened, because I like to listen, to many conversations happening online and offline where there is an outright belief that actually it doesn't even matter. Okay, that you should do this even when you don't want to, even when you're tired, and even when you're stressed. And this is really important because when we talked about the 4 power terms and conditions that any woman should be paying attention to and should be proactively negotiating before agreeing to sign a legal contract of marriage, an emotional contract of marriage to a man, bodily autonomy was one of those 4. And there's a reason for that, because there are so many external systems that have taught women, conditioned and programmed women to focus on sexual availability within a marriage, not their desire, not even actually their pleasure. So we need to talk about this because if you are getting married, there are long-held beliefs, some of them rooted in religion and culture, that say that actually you should always be sexually available to your husband regardless of how you feel. This is one of the reasons why do you think marital rape did not become a crime in many countries, particularly the UK, until the early to mid 90s? All right. So because women are taught that marriage involves sacrifice, husbands have needs. Oh, that's a whole other conversation, right? If you see people twisting and turning themselves in knots, that there is a biological need that a man must meet via a woman's body. Let's be very clear here that it is indeed a need. I sometimes wonder, well, is that need the physical release or is the need the experience? And when you start asking those questions, it gets quite dicey. Because actually, if it's purely a physical need and actually the need is for the release, then why do you need to do it with a woman's body? Why must a woman give her body, make her body available for your physical release? It goes back to what I talked about all of those weeks ago about the fact that sometimes this person is seeking a release at the expense of your body. Because if it truly is meant to be a mutual reciprocal experience for both of the people, then surely desire and availability should meet. Right? If this is a biological need, I wonder sometimes, because when you hear it described, the biological need or imperative is not that of an experience which would involve the people involved, right? It's not that mutual then. It is the release that they are seeking at the expense of somebody else's body. And if you happen to be a wife, well, of course, it's your body that is going to be used for that release. Okay, so these beliefs around monogamy creating obligations, that's another one. That, a man does not sign up to be celibate, he signs up to be monogamous. You see the extremes here, right? Apparently your wife deciding she does not want to for whatever reason is you being subjected to celibacy. It's not quite the same thing. That is not logical or even accurate, actually, to describe it as such. Okay. And then, of course, women are told that actually being sexually available means that they are able to maintain the relationship. It's a kind of MOT, so to speak, of keeping the relationship going. So therefore, you do it just to maintain it. And by the way, you see men and women engaging in these types of conversations, regardless also of sexual orientation. Sometimes, actually, there is a belief that engaging in this way, even when you don't want to, is the way you contribute to maintaining that relationship. And then, of course, there's the adage that wives have a duty. I certainly grew up in an environment where when this was being discussed, women were often portrayed as the ones that manipulate and withhold deliberately. Never mind the fact that it's actually your body. It is your personal, intrinsic, internal function here, that you should have the bodily autonomy to decide whether or not you want to share it or not. And I've talked to you about this before. The fact is, it's like hospitality, right? You go to somebody's home, a good guest turns up when they are invited. When they are invited, number one. Number two, you turn up with a gift. Usually you don't turn up with your empty hands. Right? And the hospitality can be revoked at any point. But we are in a place, and it's not new, that women's bodily autonomy is regularly ignored, overlooked. And in fact, you are encouraged in the context of marriage, actually, to completely self-abandon in the name of keeping a grown adult man's mood level. He's a grown adult man. He should be able to manage his own emotions without needing to use your body to do so. That is called being a mature adult. That's what that is. If you require somebody else to give you access to their body so that you can be in a better mood, that is a problem. That is immaturity. It's an inappropriate request. Like I say, if in actual fact, the focus of this is the experience, the connection, then surely you need the other person to be enthusiastically willing, not just available. Surely you care about whether they want to, whether they enjoy it, what their needs are. You see, sometimes we have to listen carefully because you're talking about connection and experience when in actual fact, if it's a biological need, well, you are just seeking a release using somebody else's body. Some of the comments I see under some of these videos is revealing. And this is why it's so important to have the conversation about bodily autonomy before you marry, even if you've been doing it before marriage. Okay, this isn't even just for the ones who are going into it who've abstained. It doesn't matter. You need to get to the bottom of what are you thinking? What do you truly believe about my bodily autonomy and my right to bodily autonomy? Because there were people from religious backgrounds who genuinely believe that the body is now owned by the other person. And in that ownership notion and belief, you must always be available even if you don't want to, which is very ironic. Very ironic when you think about it. And we'll go on to discuss that in a moment. So often the critical admission is that she didn't want to, but she should do it anyway. This is what wives are told. Right? And so that means that we've already, if that's true, we've already accepted that desire and consent are not identical. You can want something, but not consent to it. Right? You cannot want something, but consent to it. Compliance and willingness are not identical. Because what we're essentially saying to women in marriages is you must comply. You must meet his needs. Participation and enthusiasm are not identical. This is one of the reasons why when you think about the way consent is discussed over the last maybe 5-10 years, they talk about enthusiastic consent for a reason, right? Because participation and enthusiasm are not identical. We know this because if we're to accept that in a marriage you should do it even when you don't want to, we understand that it is possible. In fact, you are being recommended. We're being told it's advisable as a woman that you allow somebody to access your body even when you don't want to. What does that say? So what happens then when you're outside of a marriage? Because this is what I've found very interesting as I'm listening to people. Because actually, if you can come up with all of these so-called logical reasons, sometimes cultural, sometimes biological, sometimes religious reasons as to why women should have sex when they don't want to, and how it can be justified within a marriage. And I mean, the worst thing is to tell somebody you should do it because God said you should. Yeah, that's fun. That feels great, doesn't it? That's respectful. That's dignified. But you tell them that. So what changes then outside of the context of marriage? Yeah, see, if a woman says, I really didn't want to, I felt pressured, I felt guilty, I don't know how to say no, right? I did it to avoid conflict. I was afraid of what would happen if I refused. Well, what happens then? Well, society tends to respond and say, well, that's impossible. How could you have done something you didn't want to do? If you didn't want to do it, you didn't have to do it. Why would you feel pressured? Why would you possibly feel pressured and guilty? Why? Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just say no? You consented, you chose it. But when we're talking about married women and they express the same sentiments, we have some kind of different rationale. And in fact, we tell that's impossible. Well, it's not, because married women are doing it. They're being asked to when they don't want to, right? It doesn't make any sense to me, which tells me that as a society, we do know what coercion is. And that's that whole conversation that's happening right now on TikTok with that voice memo situation. People are turning themselves in knots and needs about whether what coercion is and adding on these extra parts to it. It really doesn't matter if someone feels pressured. That's like me saying I kicked somebody, but they didn't feel the pain, so it wasn't really a kick. It wasn't violence. That is not the litmus test. You know what I mean? Sometimes people betray people, cheat on people, and they don't know. Does it mean that cheating didn't happen? No. So the fact that you may not, as an individual woman, for example, think to yourself or feel under threat, that doesn't mean that the language and the behavior and the actions that the other person is demonstrating is not coercion. Yeah, that's the truth. Both things can be true at the same time, is the point I'm making. I may have kicked somebody, which is an act of violence, and maybe they didn't feel any physical pain. That doesn't mean I didn't kick them. That doesn't mean that that's not violence. And so we have to think more logically about these things. And some of these conversations are uncomfortable for people because no one wants to acknowledge that actually, when you get married, if there is an expectation that you have sex with your husband, even when you don't want to, that isn't quite right. And don't even get me started on these people who keep saying things like, well, men do things they don't want to do. So no, mowing the lawn, going out to work is not the same as having to have sex with someone when you don't want to. And you shouldn't need a reason. Why must you have a headache? Why must you be unwell? Maybe you just don't want to. And every adult human being should have the right to say, this is not what I want to do. It is your body. It is your body fundamentally. I find it extremely disturbing that we think that we should have rights over somebody else's body. Under any guise, religious, cultural, I don't care what it is. And you have to check somebody's mentality, quite frankly, and their sense of decency and their character. If they genuinely believe that they should be able to seek a release at the expense of your body and with your body, knowing that you don't really want to do it, knowing that you're not very enthusiastic about it, they still desire it. I will never understand how people still desire to have sex with someone that has given them indication, verbally or otherwise, that they don't want to. I don't even know how you can find that attractive. We really need to be checking people in reality. And a lot of the time when I talk about these things, people get very uncomfortable. If you go and look at all my other videos that I've done around some of these dynamics in relationships, people get very uncomfortable because a lot of this is unsaid and it's very exposing and often revealing about people's beliefs, how they have been conditioned, how they've been nurtured. But also some of this is not all down to conditioning, because really and truly all of us should have an innate sense of what is decent and kind and dignifying, quite frankly. And so you can't say that you respect somebody and that, God forbid, you love them, and in the same breath you're expecting them to make their bodies available when they don't want to. Let's speak less of the fact that, okay, there are women who are injured seriously after hysterectomies, after childbirth. because their husbands are demanding sex. You can go and Google this. It is factual. It is documented. It is researched. This is not folklore. This is not anecdotal. The number of women who experience very serious physical side effects, not to mention the mental, because right after birth, some of these husbands are in the room on birth day. Recently, there was a social media clip going around with a very well-known podcasting couple where the husband was shameless and flagrant, in fact, flagrant in talking about the fact that he expected sex quite soon after his wife gave birth. And on the podcast, they were discussing this, almost debating that they were doing as a couple around that time. He even, for some reason, didn't even believe that this was genuine medical advice. Which, by the way, when you go and research the history of that, they made up the 6-week rule. Actually, the 6-week rule is actually fabricated anyway, right? Why are women having to fight for their very safety and their lives? How can you say that that man fundamentally loves and respects you if right after birth, he wants to access your body to seek release? Because that is not a mutual connection, is it? And this is what I'm saying. When we start thinking more deeply about what is being said versus what the invisible contracts are, if this was truly about mutual connection and pleasure, then how could you ever expect, much less request, and then follow through with having sex with your wife that's just given birth? This is what, sometimes we need to question these things. Not sometimes, we should be. And yes, it makes people feel uncomfortable. Yes, it exposes people's characters. It does. That's the bottom line, right? And so when we see this reasoning inside marriage of she didn't want to, but she had good reasons for doing it, okay? And then on top of that, it's like, well, actually, in the dating scenario prior to marriage, if she agreed, she must have wanted it. Well, that's not the case, because there are millions of wives saying that she didn't, they're saying they didn't want to, but they had a reason to do it. And yet we say when you're outside of marriage, well, if you agreed, if you were still there, you must have wanted it. Both cannot be true at the same time. So sometimes I wonder, am I the one who's going crazy here? Because this is a contradiction completely. And this is how we wrap women in knots. This is why it's so important to think for yourself, learn how to think. And this is one of those topics that quite often you're going to hear other women say, well, why wouldn't you do it? If you love someone, naturally you want to do it. There will be all sorts of nonsense coming from other women's mouths, and you start to think, maybe she's got a point. No, do not abandon your own sense of sense and thinking and logic. Be very clear on why you're doing things and why you're not doing things. But don't take advice from other women. Yeah, don't listen to other women who say, right now on TikTok, on the voice memo chat, there's lots of women saying, oh no, at least he was honest. So what? Honestly, revealing your character does not change what your character actually is, like I said. Yeah, honestly, revealing who you are does not change who you actually are. It doesn't make who you are any different. You can honestly reveal that you are not of good character. Right? And it is true that as women in particular, in this, if you're out there dating and whatnot, it's helpful when somebody reveals who they are as early as possible. It's helpful. It doesn't change, though, what they might be revealing to you. So don't kind of give brownie points because somebody has inadvertently, might I add, sometimes revealed who they truly are. The brownie points don't need to be given to them if what they are revealing to you does not align with you. Okay, so not every encounter, of course, fits neatly into enthusiastic desire or violent force. And I want to acknowledge this. There is, of course, an uncomfortable middle. But my point here is that many women recognize that space immediately. That's why that voice memo situation is causing so much conversation, because the bottom line is when you listen to that voice memo, it doesn't sound comfortable. There's something about it that seems off. And people obviously have their different takes and angles on it. But ultimately, there is actually general agreement that there was something about that voice memo, the content of the voice memo, that does not seem kosher. There's something about it that's not quite right, regardless of what people are, the different angles that people are taking, right? People are trying to justify it, rationalize it, explain it from their perspective. But I think what I'm seeing and observing is that there's a general consensus there was something off about the content of that voice memo. Regardless of whether you think, phew, at least he told her early doors that he had certain expectations. And by the way, having a desire and an expectation actually is two different things. You can desire something, but when you say to someone, this is what I expect, and or else, that's a problem. Right? And so things like obligation, guilt, fear, emotional pressure, religious expectations, conflict avoidance, which a lot of human beings have been nurtured to do, is avoid conflict. And it can feel like conflict is happening when you don't want to do something and you know that you have to communicate and articulate to someone, I don't want to do something. That for a lot of people comes up as conflict. And if you are not confident or competent, and when I say competent, I'm not saying you're incompetent if you struggle to express this. I'm talking about the skill of it. Yeah, conflict resolution, conflict navigation, it is a skill, something we often have to practice as adults over time. And even then, when it comes to these very intimate personal things, it can still be difficult. It can still be difficult because quite often in these relationships, there's more on the line. And the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of people who feel uncomfortable saying, I don't want to do this because of all of the other nuances around that relationship. How is the person going to respond? How is it going to continue? I can't imagine living in a house with someone who is always asking for access to my body, and I don't want to give it to them. Who's got time for that? And this is one of the reasons why when you hear a lot of single women talking, not all, but there's a lot of single women, divorced women, separated women, women who've, recently ended a long-term cohabitation situation with a man. One of the things that is a kind of consistent thread amongst them all is that they now enjoy having bodily autonomy. Now, I can hear it now because I see a lot of people in my comments when I talk about this say things like, well, if you don't want that, don't get married. What a sad way to have to live. That if you do desire marriage in some kind of way, you now have to suspend your bodily autonomy. Because apparently those are the two choices. You either go all in on this and always be sexually available, or don't get married at all. And I'm not one personally for marriage, but the reality is human beings want to get married, or they decide to get married for various reasons. And in and around that marriage is the reality, especially if you share a home and you share a bedroom and you share a bed, that there is some kind of sexual interaction. And this is why I'm always reminding you that marriage is indeed a system of power, because it does confer additional expectations, responsibilities, and obligations onto both parties, yes, in different ways. But when it comes to bodily autonomy, onto women in particular, right? Marriage changes legal rights, financial incentives, social expectations, religious expectations, and moral obligations. That is the truth. Okay, and the same behavior receives a different label depending on whether marriage exists around it. Because actually what you're hearing people describe when they talk about a woman's obligation to be sexually available to her husband, if we were talking about that outside the context of marriage, we would absolutely identify that as coercion. Like I said, whether or not the person in the situation feels that way or not, and this is so important. Like I say, if I kick you, that is still violence, even if you don't feel any physical pain. Okay, this is why marriage absolutely functions as a system of power, not simply a romantic arrangement. And it's extremely naive to believe that to be the case. It is a system of power. So that's why as women, especially if you're a young woman, you need to be having these conversations directly and openly, and do not be afraid of the answers that may reveal themselves. Also, don't try and rationalize, make up. No, what the person's telling you is a revelation. It's a revealing of who they are and also how they see your bodily autonomy. And if somebody feels as though they should have the right to seek release at the expense of your body or using your body, that tells you what you need to know. Because really and truly a connection, if it's meant to be a connection and an experience, it should always be mutually safe, fulfilling, and pleasurable. And both people should always be enthusiastic in doing it. And I know when you listen to a lot of married couples, especially, look, I've spent years, I grew up around married people. Yeah, a lot of women say, I just do it because I have to. I just do it to make him happy. But we accept that that is apparently some kind of logic when you're a wife. But when you're outside of marriage, apparently you're the idiot. You're stupid. You must have wanted it. I don't see the difference. Quite frankly, it's just that we as a society has almost sanctified this kind of behavior when it's inside a marriage. And because a good woman, you see, the invisible contract's about being a good woman, you protect male comfort. You protect his ego. And a lot of women say that they are often engaging in sex in a marriage to help him regulate his emotions. I have seen people say that scientifically men need sex to regulate their emotions, and therefore they need access to a woman to do that. So even at the expense of your own bodily autonomy and desire, you're meant to protect his ego. This is a foolishness, okay? Because if he is a grown adult emotionally, if he is a so-called leader, he shouldn't be relying on you and your body to regulate himself. That is not adult behavior, by the way. It is simply not adult behavior. And so often women are punished when they break this invisible contract of being the good woman and sexually available all of the time. Okay, they are punished. You're told you're selfish, you're manipulative, you're withholding. I mean, some of the conversations around the voice memo guy, women are being told that they're prudes and that this is purity culture at play. It has nothing to do with that. Regardless of your religious upbringing, it's your body. You don't need some grand ideology or belief system to decide whether or not you want to, like I said, it's hospitality. You must remember this as a woman. It's tantamount to hospitality. And hospitality can be revoked. You can revoke the invitation. And if somebody doesn't show up and participate in said hospitality, like I said, bringing a guest, being a gift, being a respectful guest, you can revoke the hospitality. And so, of course, you're going to be accused of being frigid, rigid, a bad woman, ungodly even. Right? And a lot of the time when women obey this particular invisible contract by being ever sexually available to a man, by the way, you will not be rewarded in the ways you think you will. Let's just get that straight. But of course, what's happening is you're told that you will be approved of. You have the kind of status of being a wife. You're a good wife. You're selfless. You are mature. You're not like these other women. You're not like these other women. You are mature. You're being a good wife. You do not get rewarded with respect, by the way. There are women who have made themselves ever sexually available to the men in their lives, including a husband, and it doesn't mean that he will fundamentally cherish, honor, and respect you, because isn't that the promise? And it doesn't always turn out that way. See, invisible contract, the difference between what you're sold and told and what you actually go on to experience. We need to be very straight about this, because it does not actually win you any brownie points. If that man, because he's a human being, decides that he no longer wants to be with you, or the fact that you made yourself sexually available to him makes no difference at all. At all. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we comfortable naming unwanted sex in some contexts, i.e. marriage, and unwilling to name it in others? Because it's all the same. It's just actually the wrapper has changed. That is all that's happening here. And you know what? If someone believes that you should do it even when you don't want to, then they already know that wanting to do something and agreeing to do it are not always the same thing. And so society likes to play stupid when women share their experiences. They say that they felt pressure to do so. They play stupid because when we're talking about marriage, suddenly it's all okay. It's advisable. It's recommended. It is the right and good thing to do. But it's not when you're not married. It's not even possible, apparently, that you could have been coerced. And people will come up with all sorts of reasons to justify this behavior. Now, this is one of the reasons why, of course, we have the Invisible Contract Workbook, audit workbook is somewhere in the description somewhere. But this is a book that you can use to privately reflect upon the invisible contracts governing your life. Okay. And you can really think about actually, why are you making the decisions that you make around your body? Okay. What does bodily autonomy really mean for you? Because actually there's a lot of loud and confusing viewpoints, even from other women online, that honestly, I just worry sometimes, because some women are clearly just trying to survive and they're settling. When in actual fact, your bodily autonomy is yours. It's your right, and it really should not be breached just because you've gotten married. That is just unacceptable.